Welcome back to the Ambiguous Podcast. We don't know whether this will be on Chris's channel or mine, but we're going to be talking about natural law, Catholicism, and Chris's very cute dog.
Yeah.
So welcome to whoever's podcast this is finally posted on. Today I'm either interviewing or being interviewed by the one and only Chris Damian.
I'm always interviewing.
Chris takes over every show that he's been on so far.
I can't help it. I got a lot of questions. Okay, wait. I do have a question, though.
Oh, no.
For you. Yeah, we're kicking off. Okay. I'm curious, from your rad trad Catholic days, what was the role of natural law discourse?
Well, so to intro the topic, once again, natural law, Catholicism, homosexuality, all of the fun words, both when I was conservative Novus Ordo and then Catholic Inc. and then rad trad, I've always found natural law as a vague, undefined referent that you just get to send outsiders down this rabbit hole, down this rabbit trail where you don't have natural law class. And I think if you interview even most conservative or traditional Catholics and have them repeat back to you what natural law is, I don't know if they can. They can reference natural law and saying why certain sexual acts are wrong, but I don't think really anyone natural law per se.
Yeah. Well, this boy read Aristotle in Greek, so. Oh, wait, but also, I think to clarify for people, you mentioned, Catholic Inc., Rad Trad. What is Catholic Inc.?
So you got the Catholic Church, Catholics by and far, amazing, normal, well-adjusted people. And then you go to a parish and the people that have 75 books, but all on little kiosks to give out to you, like the Jehovah's Witnesses. Or if you look up Catholicism and you get down a very well-produced rabbit hole online of conservative Catholic media, now you're in Catholic Inc., which is the Catholic Church spending millions and tens of millions of dollars on content. And it's all from the same vein. They all have the same ideas. In many ways, they're copy-paste of each other.
Yeah.
And there's an infinite Catholic rabbit hole of content out there. And they all get funded by the same types of people. And they all use very much this sort of similar arguments. And then our rad trads is when your grandparents tell you about the time in the church where things were in Latin and everything was shitty. It's the people that want to bring back the shitty Latin times to the modern world, but they often see it as the solution to people don't want to be Catholic anymore. If we just did things in Latin, the magical spells would work and they would once again convert, which, and not that inherently the Latin Mass causes this, but about 2 months after somebody starts attending, now they're talking about crusades and how the Inquisition was cool. And as I found out in a recent debate, now they're defending slavery as a moral good.
That was crazy. That was actually, Charlie's distressed.
Charlie does not
make
bring
that
slavery.
Stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny as you're mentioning that. Actually, they have 75 books, and I'm like, oh, here's 15 of my 400 books. And then you're and then a well-produced podcast. Yeah. I'm like, are we the new Catholic Inc.?
Yeah. Catholic Inc.?
Yeah.
Or Catholic LLC?
Yeah. I think that is interesting. It is related, I think, to the natural law thing. Because I will say, and it's also related to my stuff, right? Because, I mean, I will say, I love natural law.
Chris manages to relate everything back to his content.
That's correct. I love natural law. Actually, also, I think a lot of people are not aware that I love the Latin Mass. I mean, I don't really, go because I think just culturally, the stuff that you are describing is not inconsistent with what I've often found.
Anti-slavery. He's an abolitionist.
Yeah.
And so
that may be shocking.
The pro-slavery circles, not always the... Yeah. They're interesting characters, not always the best or most life-giving.
Yeah. Well, and it is also interesting, too, because I think, in, these kind of, far-right circles where you do get these, apologetics related to slavery or, hierarchy between the sexes. I do think that a lot of that comes back to, they're saying they believe in these kind of more traditional views, these natural law views. I think definitely the natural law thing plays in because Aristotle talks about natural slavery, right? And if you think about Aristotle as providing the foundation for the natural law tradition, I think that a lot of people who would say that, oh, by doing that, I'm promoting natural law or I'm doing the real version of natural law, and you failing to recognize the value of slavery apologetics means that you don't really understand this thing. That feels very relevant to me.
And natural law comes up I wouldn't say your average Catholic pastor is referencing natural law in sermons at your local suburban parish. But as soon as you start getting into the Catholic media sphere, and as soon as you start diving into uh, Orthodox Catholic classes, natural law, either the ideas or the term itself starts
Yeah.
popping up more and more and more in very subtle ways, and then explicit ways. And then by the time you actually realize what's happening, you're so far in over your head that you're not Googling natural law on Wikipedia, you're Googling Ed Phaser natural law or
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Aquinas natural law, or your only resources on natural law or specifically Catholic sources by the time you go, I'm going to learn natural law.
Yeah, yeah, and like very contemporary, like Catholic
Mhm.
sources, and also Catholic sources within kind of like one tradition. I think a lot of people aren't aware that there are kind of like multiple strains of natural law, right? Actually, I think one of the books that I have on here is, oh yeah, Black Natural
Swift
Law.
candle,
Yeah,
or is that
next to the Taylor Swift. Yeah, also the devil. Yeah, Black Natural Law by Vincent Lloyd, which is a really good book, and he kind of traces Black figures that he would associate with the natural law traditions, like includes Frederick Douglass, Anna Julia Cooper, Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr. And he sees these figures as providing kind of a very helpful vision for what natural law like can do.
Mhm.
But I think that there are a lot of people today who I think would take issue with this narrative because I think they hold a view of what they would see as a competing version of natural law, even if they wouldn't articulate it that way.
The reason why we're talking about everything in natural law is Catholics either are formed by or directly use natural law arguments on homosexuality, contraception, sex before marriage. Most of the conservative Catholic ethos on matters of sexuality, especially in a debate context, are based on this philosophy or either explicitly or implicitly. And so hence why we're talking about it, because as soon as you get into the church, talking about any culture war issue, this always comes up every single time without failure. And it catches people off guard if you don't know what's being argued.
Yeah.
Because you'll say, well, sex is for reproduction and or marriage is for the good of the spouses and for the raising and rearing of offspring. Or being gay is wrong because sex is for reproduction. And so if we don't use it for reproduction, now we're breaking the law. And so there are some like intuitive arguments
Yeah.
where they're smuggling in this for language and the purpose of and
Yeah.
the ends of. And as soon as you hear that language, as you go, throw a flag on the play, instant review, and then you get to dive into natural law. But like I said, most Catholics, when you say like, oh, so what is natural law? They'll use the sort of like sex is for X, Y, and Z. And then you go, yeah, so like take me through what you think about natural law. And they go, oh, they might say, well, according to natural law X, Y, and Z. And then you go, tell me about natural law. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, there are multiple ways of viewing natural law. One is natural law consists of a view, and you see like John Finnis and like a lot of like lawyers recently who work in the natural law space doing the like new natural law thing, where for them like natural law consists of these kind of like goods that you identify and then you kind of work your way from those specific goods. Like marriage is one of them. Whereas there are others, and I would include myself in this category, that focus on natural law as kind of like a methodology. And there's like a little bit of trickery in it. Because for this tradition, and I think it comes out of Aristotle. Basically, natural law, you just start with like, like what does everyone aim after? They aim after happiness. And then, like what's conducive for that versus not conducive for that. And I think if you hold that view of natural law and you see, there's another book. I forget his first name, but Bolin, he has this great book, Tolerance Among the Virtues, and talks about natural law as basically like a methodology of you find out, like you look at things and you identify what's best for them. And then from there you can figure out, the purpose of them and all of that. And I think that he would argue that like everyone is always doing natural law, whether they recognize it or not. But that's not how most Catholics in these spaces would talk about natural law. They'd say like, I'm doing natural law and you're doing something else.
I've always seen natural law in Catholic debates be a sort of game of who's on first, where it's like, are you observing how things work? Are you talking about true, authentic human flourishing? Or are you talking about these metaphysical teloi of various things? And anytime you try to pin them down on one thing, which is, so are we trying to figure out what is best for society's flourishing? And it goes, no. Like, we are trying to respect the things that God has created. And you go, so are we following divine law? It's like, no. Like, this is just observable out there in the world, right? Like, sex is for reproduction. You go, okay, so are we observing what's natural? And then by the time you're there, you're back to playing whack-a-mole at the start. And so it's this like ever shifting conversational piece, because even natural law doesn't mean just what happens naturally. And Catholics will point it out because it's like, well, it's not just that animals.
Yeah, the gay penguins.
Yeah, the gay penguins, because animals also do unconsensual sexual acts. And you go, yeah, I'm not saying that because whatever animals do, we can do. But you, Mr. Catholic, brought it to me that like this is how things function in nature. And so you try to pin them down on that. It's like, no. It's X, Y, and Z. And I've found it to just always be shifting around, and then by the time they've led somebody through 4 or 5 like loops on the merry-go-round, the conversation's done and the Catholic got away scot-free because it looks like the other person was like trying to pin them down.
Oh yeah,
and the
Catholic
Catholic
like the whack-a-mole thing. Yeah. I mean, I'd be curious, just from what you've seen and also just been engaged in those sorts of arguments, what do you think is the reason for that? Why do you think that structure of argumentation happens? What does it provide?
All of the conservative Catholic arguments like to start with a sort of like, it's basic intuition or like it's common ground with culture, that X, Y, and Z, right? Because you go, sex is for reproduction. It sort of means one thing in a conversation. Like, I wouldn't say that like animals evolved and sex was completely divorced from reproduction. And so Catholics like to start there because it makes sense, right? Like the average person would say yes to the statement. But Catholics take that statement that everyone agrees on and go, well, we said it's for reproduction, so anything against it is breaking this natural law. And so they like to smuggle in the second point, because it's really pedantic in a debate. And I've run into this where it's like, well, do you agree that sex is for reproduction? I go, sex can be used for reproduction. They go, no, sex is for reproduction. I go, sex is used for reproduction. Right? It's like this. So I look like the asshat who's like, trying to like, trying to be really, really pedantic, not even just semantic. But they get to smuggle it in because everyone agrees on it and then get to roll out the second part.
Well, I think a lot of it's just like responding with hidden assumptions, right? And I also just think that style of debate, so much of it is like grounded in like tricking people into saying things that they may not necessarily believe and then committing them to that view, as opposed to understanding where they're really coming from. And so there's a psychological structure to the debate that I think really is grounded in, I think, taking advantage of people. That's really interesting.
Because then as soon as you, and I've had this in conversations, namely with Nick Fuentes' fans before, where you tell them like, always the best. Charlie, what do you think?
Oh, well, there you go.
Where as soon as you name natural law, I've had times where they go, no, I'm not saying that. I was like, I know that you're saying natural law because the books that we both read are about natural law. So it's not even that Catholics sort of have built this like trickery and they know all of the inside tricks. But even sort of learning apologetics is about mining like a layer deeper for every time you ask why. And not every Catholic apologist even knows that they're on this strain.
I think that's
And so when you go to cut to the bottom, they don't know how to operate there.
Oh gosh, there was something you mentioned earlier that I'm trying to remember. It was something around here. I'm gonna put up Charlie upstairs real quick.
No, Charlie.
Okay. I mean, I'd be curious, like, so for you, I mean, would you say that you disagree with natural law? Where are you at when it comes to natural law?
When it comes to natural law, the natural end of my positions with natural law, like I said, I find natural law to be a vacuous term. Like, it doesn't mean anything in conversation. So when somebody's like, so what do you think about natural law or Catholics agreement? Like, so do you disagree with natural law? It's like, well, first of all, natural law disagrees with you because there are so many competing theories of natural law. And it's one of the philosophies where nobody is using the same exact meaning behind it.
Yeah.
Like utilitarian is sort of like you can communicate what utilitarianism is, and like there's certainly different schools of thought on it,
Yeah.
but like everyone in the conversation knows the approach.
Yeah.
With natural law, it can mean anything from, well, we're just wanting to look out for society's best interests and we're all participating in natural laws like reason.
Yeah.
And then there's the like very small Catholic conception of it, which is
Yeah.
we know the very specific ends of things and we know the very specific things that we can and can't
Yeah.
do when it comes to working or use other than or contrary to.
Yeah.
Like there's all these different stages that we'll get into, and it's like a giant word salad. But I find it a meaningless term nowadays in a debate discussion. But Chris here is an expert. He's actually going to tell us what natural law is, because Catholics like to pretend
Yeah.
that they have a monopoly on natural law because they've never heard about natural law from the academic side of things and where that fits into ethics and metaethics and all the different fields
Yeah.
and the different schools of thought on natural law.
Yeah.
They just hear natural law and think that they have a monopoly on natural law,
Yeah.
which is not true.
Well, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert, but I do think that I have a not common perspective on natural law, which I think makes it feel really novel to a lot of people. But I think that my view is more the classical view. I mean, when you think about what Aristotle was doing, I mentioned earlier, he starts out as Nicomachean Ethics, and he basically says, if you look around at what people are doing or what people are aiming at, ultimately it looks like everyone's looking for happiness.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he basically asks, like, okay, what are people's views on what happiness is? And he basically engages in like a sociological survey. And that's where his work goes from. And basically he looks at the people around him and the world around him and says that, okay, well, if you understand what tends towards like leads to like flourishing or like eudaimonia, like
Eudaimonia.
like the deepest happiness, that'll give you a sense of like what people and things are for. And that leads to, I think today, you get like the classic, like, Father Mike Schmidt's like chair argument, right? Of, oh, okay, well, if you want to figure out like what's the good of the chair, you have to ask like, well, what is it made for? And like, what's its best use? And so like, like sitting on the chair is like the end of the chair, whereas like beating someone with the chair is contrary to its end. But I think that a lot of people, I think where they go wrong or where they miss something is when they try to make the arguments too easy, or when they kind of ignore, real counters to them. Even for the chair, you might say, and a lot of times this is used as an analogy to make arguments around sex, right? So then they obviously connect that to like genitalia, and they're like, okay, well, if you like look at like male and female genitalia, their like highest use is to like procreate. And so doing things that are contrary to the ends of genitalia. But then, you go back and you return to the chair analogy and, maybe beating someone with a chair is not the best use of the chair, but it still could be a good use of a chair if what you're doing is defending your family from someone that's attacking you. And using the chair in that way, in that situation, is not something that's evil, right? And I think that there are similar analogies to be made, for example, like when it comes to sex. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the Catholic position on sex is...
Which is missionary. I'm
God.
kidding.
Oh my God. That's fine. We can leave it in. That's not to say the Catholic position on sex has to be wrong, but it is to say that I think there are a lot of limitations. If you take natural law seriously and you actually want to follow these arguments, there are limitations to them. One of the ones that I come back to often is, well, if that is like the best end for sex, anything against that is a great evil, is intrinsically disordered, then what do we do with smoking, right? The ends of the mouth is to like inhale, to communicate, oxygen, sustenance, etc. And smoking literally kills you, right? And there are a lot of people that would say, oh, well, sure, it doesn't provide, like sustenance, it doesn't provide oxygen, it doesn't provide communication. But, doing that can help facilitate these other things, right? And then if you're doing that and then you follow the analogies, then, you can follow that to things like masturbation, right? And you're saying, okay, well, if you're going to admit it in that instance, why is it that natural law, all of these rules apply to every body part except genitalia? Right. And I think that a lot of Catholics, they don't take those questions seriously, because I think a lot of times they're afraid that if they admit that these are serious questions, then their positions on sex and sexuality won't hold up. And I think often what they fail to realize is that everyone else around them has already realized that. Right. And if you want a grounding for these rules, you can't just go into these easy arguments that no one that disagrees with you doesn't buy or buys.
You can see even from everything that you've run through so far is that what natural law is and how it gets applied is incredibly unstable.
Yeah.
By unstable, I just mean that if you have a sort of moral prescription or generality out there, if everyone gets to supremely contradictory positions at the end, it's unstable, which means like we all don't get to the same decision. So if you get a bunch of scientists in a room and you go, you wipe all of the world's data away and you just go, we're trying to figure out the force of gravity. Like, how far does an object drop when it falls through the air? Right, that's a question. And if you get a number of scientists all across the world to do the same test, it's very stable in that it gets them all to the same conclusion. With natural law, it's unstable because you give this idea of natural law and then you give it to 10 natural law philosophers and they're all going to come to different positions. And coming to different positions for an ethical theory doesn't mean that, like, it's inherently wrong, right? We were talking about deontological or utilitarian or all these different things. Like, it's not that ethical theories have to be coherent and lead to the same positions, but it just means that, like, referencing natural law as a slam dunk argument against homosexuality doesn't work, because it'd be like, oh, well, according to utilitarianism, like, homosexuality is wrong. And then you're like, what do you mean by that? And like, if you ask utilitarians, they say that. And then you go, let's talk to them. And the answer is like, no. It doesn't mean that the argument's right or wrong. It just means that referencing utilitarianism when you stub your toe or when you have a moral procedure, like, you have to explain it.
Yeah.
And I think what Catholics, as you were saying, fail at is explaining why masturbation is something that, even if there was a gun to your head and you were held hostage and you had to do it once to save the entire planet, you would not be allowed to do it under a natural law decision. But if it was someone smoking 20 packs of cigarettes every day until they died, that would be like, well, natural law doesn't say that it's wrong. So, okay, now we're in this crazy quagmire, which is you can't masturbate once ever according to natural law, but smoking is okay. And it doesn't mean that those moral prescriptions are set. It just means natural law, in referencing it, like, well, it's against the natural law for two men to get married. It's like, fuck, that doesn't add anything to the conversation. You just referenced a thing.
Well, and the other thing too is, I think the smoking thing is interesting because, saying, oh, well, but natural law doesn't say it's wrong. The thing is, that depends what you mean by natural law. I mean, I would say, but maybe it does, right? If we are reflecting on the ends and like human flourishing and the goods of these various activities, I might actually say that, like, no, natural law says that we shouldn't do this. But I think that there are a lot of people that would say, oh, well, natural law says that this is wrong, because what they think natural law is it's this list of rules on these certain types of behavior, and then you follow a logical structure based on this formula, right? And I think that's a very different activity from what, like, Aristotle is doing and Plato is doing. And I mean, honestly, even like what Aquinas is doing, right? Like, Aquinas, the structure of the Summa is dialogical, and it does this kind of like back and forth motion when it comes to a lot of arguments. And like, I view natural law as something that's dynamic and responses, and it develops as, like, cultures develops and is constantly responding, which is very consistent with Newman's view of, like, Catholic doctrine, which I do think also really informs how I approach, natural law.
Because if natural law, as Aquinas has mentioned, is sort of true human flourishing, would be the sort of like 3-word parlay on that, right? If natural law is meant to look at society and figure out what is best for society overall, because there's this idea with, well, if we just do utilitarianism, then you get into some things where it's like, well, if we double the happiness of one half the population and exterminate the rest.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so utilitarianism
It might
might
be
not
the
always be
way
the
to
best.
create happiness.
Even rule-based utilitarianism, it's like, okay, so there's some issues there. And then when we're looking at rights and deontology, like every ethical theory, there's sort of like, well, if we really stress test it, there's some issues with like that being the universal rule. And so with a natural idea, which is like true human flourishing, which is to look at to balance rights and social responsibility and caring for the poor, but also having freedom for people to run businesses and having freedom on health issues, but like also trying to protect people that might be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
Like you can say natural law is a sort of general statement that we're on a journey to figure out, which is
Yeah.
true, authentic human flourishing. But that view, and the one that you're talking about, is a fantastic one. And Catholics will pay lip service to it, like, yes, we do want the good of society. And then the thing that that requires then is actually looking at the world as it is, which is like, well, does allowing for gay marriage work for the benefit or the detriment of society? Natural law wouldn't have an answer until you figure that out. And then you go, wait, it does actually add to the flourishing of society. So then gay marriage would then be included in the natural law.
Yeah.
Or what do we have to say about, is healthcare a human right? Do we want to universalize it? And whatever you think about it, if we try it out and it's ends up making society flourish more, now that's part of the natural law. And that's a beautiful way to look at it, but it requires updates, as you're saying. It requires looking at the world and testing things out. Because let's say gay marriage ended up in everyone crashing their cars immediately after the Bergefell decision. You go, maybe it's not in the best interest of society
Yeah.
to allow this. But I think it's a much healthier and flourishing way to look at natural law.
Yeah.
And Catholics will say everything we do is for the good of society. And then you go, what about this that is clearly not? And they go, well, it's not about the goods of society. It's about what's right or what's natural. Like,
Yeah.
that's what I'm talking about. Where all these conversations with specifically Catholics on natural law is not what most natural law philosophers and with their PhD in it mean, but Catholics will just play the merry-go-round of, so it's for the flourishing of society? Yes. What about this? Well, no. So natural law is this. And then you go, so just this. And you're like, no, that. And then you just go on this merry-go-round.
Yeah. Well, and I think for a lot of Catholics, and this includes a lot of leaders in the church, and I would say also a lot of bishops, for them, there's this commitment to like a particular set of issues, and they don't always cohere or have consistency. And I do think that part of it is because, there's a tendency, and I think it's also just natural in a way. We're all limited. We only have a certain amount of capacity for what we can focus our time and attention and energy on. But we don't think about flourishing in an integrated way. And so you have these weird things where I think like Catholics will often even contradict Catholic positions. And I often come back to religious liberty as an example of this. So, you have the American, present day American constitutional approach to religious liberty, which is basically that, there's going to be certain realms that we deem religious. And because they're religious, the government will have minimal intrusion or even involvement in those spaces. Employment's a great example. So, if someone is deemed a minister and the pastor gets up and I'm firing all of my black staff, because they're black, they're all very good, but black people are bad, so I'm firing them.
Clip that.
Yeah, I mean, but the American approach to religious liberty is that we're not even going to consider that case for the purposes of like employment discrimination because it's a religious context, or because we would deem all these people ministers. And you'll have the Catholic bishops get up and defending that version of religious liberty, which actually is a version that's inconsistent with Catholic teaching on religious liberty. And Catholic teaching does say, and this comes out of the documents from the Second Vatican Council, that the government has a right and a responsibility to protect society from abuses under the pretext of religion. And I think that part of why we miss this is because we get so focused on this one little thing, religious liberty, that we lose sight of like what's actually good for the community and what's good for these people here. I don't know how a Catholic in good faith could get up and say that a pastor doing that is doing something that's good and that should be defended in the name of religion. And yet that's exactly what Catholic bishops will do. And we see that quite a bit in especially in employment discrimination cases.
To bring it back to the chair argument, that Catholics
share.
will go from sort of, natural law is trying to have the most flourishing society that's respecting rights and balancing things and what we ought to not do. And then, which would mean natural law would have things to say on immigration, on healthcare, on reproductive care, on all these different things. Natural law would be involved under that view. What I often see as popular presentations of natural law in Catholic settings, specifically around theology of the body, is to look at something like, well, I have a glass right here. And we say that the glass is for drinking. And so if I'm drinking and it's not poisoned, it is working well. But if I try to use it underneath my fridge to prop up my fridge, it would shatter the glass. And we'd say, well, it's because the glass is not for this thing.
Yeah.
But you might have cases where if I just put this really nice glass on the shelf and it's displayed, it's not working against the ends of the glass which are drinking, but it's used contrary to, or other than, I should say, not contrary to. Contrary to would be like trying to prop up my fridge with it and it shatters. A use other than would be like displaying it. And even though I'm not drinking on it, I'm still respecting it. But the ends of this glass are to drink, which, if you're listening along, that sort of seems reasonable on its face, right? Which is like, it would shatter underneath your fridge. And putting on a display case is still kind of using it. But like, yeah, glasses are meant for drinking compared to spoons. And so I think all of those presentations, they start with like some analogy, which seems intuitive.
Yeah.
But the thing is that they're smuggling in meaning, which is to say that like you're getting somebody to agree to, it'd be like knocking on somebody's door and you're like, you really care about people? And they go, yeah. And then you go, and so I brought my entire family and we're going to move into your basement.
Yeah.
It's sort of smuggling meaning where when Chris says, yes, I care about people,
Yeah.
what I'm really, as the person on his front door, I'm smuggling this meaning, which is, and caring about people involves specifically my entire family that just pulled up.
Yeah.
And so it might, and then if Chris says no, and I go, Chris is lying, I don't know what he's on about. He said he cares about people. It's like, well, because we meant two different things. And so in the glass analogy, it sort of seems intuitive that, yeah, you don't want to shatter your glass. The problem is that they actually just baked in this 3-stage philosophy, which is every single thing, not just this glass, but trees and cars and our bodies have 3 categories of ends, which are things that they are meant for, things that you can use in spite of, and things that if you use it that way, it's bad. And so they've smuggled in this 3-stage thing that seems intuitive in a normal conversation, this is the difficult part because I sound like an asset when it's like, well, a glass, I mean, it's for drinking, but you can use it for drinking. But I'm not going to admit that there's this 3-tier hierarchy to everything. Because then in popular presentations, it's like, then this candle and this book and my phone and these podcast mics and everything has ends. Not just like determinations, which is like, I mean, like you can put water in your pool and that's cool. And like, probably don't just like get rid of all of the Earth's water seems intuitive. But that everything, if you had like a magical wand that could like scan the QR code for every item, it's got a 3-phase list to everything. And so on sexuality, then they sort of smuggle it in, which is like, marriage is for kids. It's like, I mean, that's what marriage is for. What they're smuggling in is the other premise, which is anything apart from kids is no longer marriage. So you can agree to say, marriage is for kids and for spouses. Like that's, even as a gay person myself, I don't disagree with that statement. But if it means, that's what we refer to it being for, not that marriage, if you had a special scanner at the courthouse, it would read the QR code of marriage as this ethereal thing would go, it has to be this, and if it's not this, it's bad. I'll stop the presentation there because getting into why I think all of this falls apart, because I'll move into the debunking. But
well, I have a couple of thoughts there. One is I do agree that you have to be really careful about these simplistic arguments that really work on people who haven't really thought about these things before. I think that there are a lot of Catholics, especially young Catholics, who will hear these kinds of arguments for the first time, and they sound really compelling, right? And so then they buy into the theory and order their lives around them. But then as they engage more in life becomes more complex, and then they're faced with the choice over time of, do I grapple with and acknowledge the complexity, or do I pretend that the complexity is not there so that I can hold on to this very simple system? And for the people that, choose to hold and face the complexity, when that simple narrative breaks apart that was supposed to explain everything, then it can make you question everything, and everything about like your faith and everything about that worldview. And so I think that Catholics who want to have something that's sustainable, they should approach it with a, here's something that I'm presenting to you, and, you'll develop kind of like nuance and complexity over time. But that's just not how it tends to be presented. And the other thing that I would also say is I think that marriage is a really good example of the way that natural law could work in relation to Catholic teaching. And the way that I would illustrate it is actually it changes to canon law when it comes to marriage over the last century. So, you had, for the vast majority of the church's history, like a variety of ends, but primarily the end of, marriage is for like having children. And, you'll even have, I think it's either Augustine and Aquinas, or it's just Augustine, who says that, like God created like a helpmate for Adam. And, if God wanted someone who would be like a good friend and like useful, then he would have created another man. And like, it only makes sense that God created a woman, so then that way you could procreate. And so the end of marriage is clearly
transitioned from a male rib into an entire female.
Yeah.
Eve's the first LGBT person in the Bible.
God.
I'm gonna get shellacked for that.
I'm gonna let you. That's fine. That's fine. People can shellac. That's fine. No, but and then you have this development over time, and the church is grappling with the various ways in which people relate to marriage. And canonically, the end of marriage was the the having children and rearing children. And then, you could kind of over time, there was this discussion of like the secondary end of like the union of the spouses, the good of the spouses. And it was only in the last few decades where canon law and kind of like official church teaching changed, where, the good of the spouses and the union of the spouses, removed from their secondary end to join like the primary end alongside the bearing and raising of children. And I think this is a really good example of the ways in which kind of like natural law can develop. And it's also a good illustration of like Newman's idea of the development of doctrine, development of ideas, where, you have the world has this one understanding of marriage, and it engages with this understanding of marriage, but then like cultures change, the world change, and as we learn more about how people live out marriage, and society like develops the way it relates to marriage, there may be new things that we learn or that we articulate, and that become a part of our like fixed articulated understanding of these things. And so that's how it could make sense to say that this shift from a not really an end to a secondary end to joining alongside a primary end, the union of the spouses alongside bearing and rearing of children, that can make sense if you view natural law in this way and you view the development of doctrine in this way. It makes less sense if you pick up what I think is a popular understanding of natural law, which is we've identified these particular goods and they're fixed for all of eternity, and people need to follow these logical structures, otherwise they're not doing natural law, which obviously is not a view I would ascribe to.
Because the tricky thing about natural law is sometimes it arrives at the right conclusions, but the explanation is not the right explanation. So if you take a math test and you get all of the right answers, but because you cheated off of your neighbor, you might have gotten the right answers. But if your explanation is when the teacher is confronting you, you go, well, it's because my great-grandfather was a math genius, and actually he has been communicating with me spiritually because of reincarnation. And you go on this roundabout journey to how you got to the right answers. It might sound nice, and it might be a true fact that you got all of the right answers, but the explanation is not how you got there. And so when it comes to this sort of popular thing that a lot of apologists use out there is like, why do we allow for these sex acts and not these other ones? They'll bring up the most grotesque examples and very illegal examples, and they go, why do we say that this thing is wrong?
Yeah.
Well, it's because it works against the ends of sexuality, which are for the union, or for babies and bonding. And you go, you might get at the right answer, which is this thing that we have made illegal is illegal, but it's not because necessarily of your explanation.
Yeah.
And so we'll have to go, well, yeah, like if I want to say X, Y, and Z things are wrong or bad or illegal, this other person gave me a framework, which is sex is for babies and bondings, which is why we don't allow these things and we don't these other things, which sounds nice, but it doesn't mean that's the only reason. And so to bring it back to my glass and why I don't think natural law in popular presentations works well
Mm.
is because, yes, putting this underneath the fridge and getting 4 glasses and having them all be crushed, it's probably not wise. Well, why is it not wise? It's not because embedded somewhere in this glass, there's the ends of this glass are for drinking. And if I had my view of God and could scan this item, there's those things which are to work against it are bad. It's not that. Like, I don't know where that would be in this glass. The reason why you wouldn't want to prop your fridge up on this is because it would break and then your fridge would fall over. And we don't want that. And you go, well, what if somebody wanted to do that? It's like, then you start a business around like smashing things, which is like a new business model that's out there. Like, why do we say putting this under your fridge is unwise? Isn't because somewhere embedded in this glass are the answers to you can have it be viewed, but you can't have it crushed, but you can drink from it, and that's the best one. That's not the explanation that's here. Because if you have a good enough glass, it can also be a vase. And how do we determine if it's good as a vase or not? Like, this probably wouldn't be good because I'm guessing the flowers would fall out. And it's not much deeper than that. It's not that, like, when this was being manufactured, God came in and infused this thing with the list of this can't be used as a vase, and that's the explanation. And it's the same thing with sexuality, where often they'll go, well, even biologists would say that sex is for reproduction. And you go, yeah, I mean, you might get one to agree to that statement. But if you ask a biologist, what do animals use sex for? They go for prophylactic, which is for for stress reduction, for fun as a social activity, and also one of the uses of sex is reproduction in animals. Well, so you're saying sex is for reproduction? You go, no, 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 no. If we just use different words, which is like a description or a question, which is what is sex used for? Now we can answer that question. The premise in there is, well, it's for this thing. And in a colloquial sense, which is like a normal conversation, if Chris is talking about, he's getting a biology degree and says, well, it's for X, Y, and Z, right? The lungs are for breathing. I'm not going to be like, actually, like, I'm not going to fight Chris on that point of lungs are for breathing. But the thing is, so they smuggle that in, and then you go, well, to use your lungs contrary to anything else is wrong. We're having a conversation, but behind it is, well, it would be wrong, or smoking is unwise because of health effects, because of societal things, because of other things, not that.
Yeah.
If I scanned Chris's lungs, there would be the things that he could use them for, not use them for, or use them on other things. Because natural law is not a stable thing.
Yeah. Well, I think that, what you had to say, I mean, there are a number of things that were really interesting there. One thing to pull out is what you had to say about, people treating natural law like you have the conclusion to the math answer, and then you just kind of like make up how you got there, whether it makes sense or it's accurate or not. I think that there is something challenging here about specifically Christian natural law, because, you have, Aquinas articulates this pretty well, where you have this view that God has revealed certain things to us about humankind and what's good and what's not good. And basically it's that, God helps us so that we don't have to do all of the work to get to these complex conclusions that we may or may not get to because of deficiencies or lack of capacity in our reasoning. And so there is also quite a bit of, the Christian tradition picking up of, well, we're taking the like end answer. But then I think that as a Christian, I don't have an issue with that. I do ascribe to that view. I think that where the challenge comes and what can be really frustrating and also really turn people off from Christianity is when you take those conclusions and then you make up arguments that explain them to you, but they don't make any sense to anyone else. And then you get frustrated with them for not understanding them, even though this is this thing that you made up in your mind. And you ascribe the lack of understanding to a lack of capacity or intelligence on their part, when in reality, it's actually just like your failure to understand how people work in the world and how people think in the world. It's this thing that I think often comes up in natural law circles where, they say like these goods are intuitive. And my view on like things that are intuitive is, yeah, like things are always intuitive to the people that they're intuitive for.
Yeah.
Right. Like you don't just get to decide what's intuitive for everyone. If someone else says that it's not intuitive for them, then it's not intuitive. And you saying that it is doesn't change that fact. But I think that there's all kinds of like weird condescension, and people use natural law as a justification to make really bad arguments and then condemn people for not following their bad arguments.
Yeah. If people just outright say, well, I follow this because this is the Catholic idea that I subscribe to. It's like, cool. Like, you don't need to justify to me why you and your spouse don't use birth control. Like, I'm not the everyone must be on birth control police, and then you have to defend your view in order to opt out of the system. The problem is that your justification of, let's say, that the common talking point of, well, actually putting a barrier between you and your spouse means that you don't want all of them. I want all of you except for your infertility. Or that's, the modern world medicalizes women's pregnancy and says that that is not okay and that you must be available at all times to your husband. Like, there's a lot of these sort of poetic, quasi-hybrid natural law arguments, which if that's what you and your spouse think, cool. Like, you're not, like I said, we're not showing up to your bedroom to enforce it. The problem is if you go, well, for me,
I think
my
some
spouse,
Catholics want to.
well, that's what I'm saying is that it's the only people that are then enforcing this are the Catholics who go, well, we have to get rid of all birth control. And it's like, how do we get there? And it's like, well, having your spouse put on a condom means that you don't want all of them. It's like, no, I get how you might see that as a beautiful statement for you and your spouse, but oftentimes, especially if, let's say someone, if they got pregnant, they would die from another pregnancy. It's actually a beautiful thing, and protecting your spouse from death by using contraception. So it's a more beautiful thing to do that. And so it's this weird world where if your understanding of natural law and Catholic ideas are cool, awesome. Like, you don't have to justify it. But if you go and everyone else is dumb for thinking that sex can be used for non-procreative ends, because the natural law says that sex is for this particular thing, and everyone else is sinning, so then you got to justify and you got to back it up. Because natural law, another talking point, on top of the chair argument, is the anorexia argument, which if you're struggling with an eating disorder, it's like, this is the point to turn it off, because it gets very dark from here. Because the idea is like, well,
No,
why
this
do we
is
say,
so many priests make this
oh
argument.
yeah, all the time, which is like, well, when somebody experiences bulimia, in which they eat food and then they make themselves throw it back up, why do we say that that's wrong? Well, it's because the stomach is for eating, for nutrition. And to make yourself regurgitate food is to work against the end. And that's why eating disorders are so harmful. Not only do they like, and I know so many people in this room have dealt with it, this sort of like fundy, baby fundy voice.
The preachy voice.
But the thing is, like, once again, you got to the right conclusion, which is we don't want to promote eating disorders. But your explanation, which is our digestive tract, if we scan it with our metaphysical barcode, says, well, everything must be for eating and working against it is never allowed, but somewhere in between with junk food, that's okay. It's like, well, you just had a crazy explanation for the right conclusion, which is, yes, with eating disorders, let's help people get to mental health professionals to work on eating disorders and to live healthy. But the reason why we say that isn't because their stomach is built for nutrition, and the only reason why it's harmful is because you are working against the natural ends or teloi of the stomach. You got to the right conclusion with a different explanation, but then that explanation that is inadequate and not true then gets applied to sexuality, which is homosexuality and birth control are sexual bulimia is something that I hear all the time, which is you just got to stop saying that. Even if you think the argument works, it is an incredibly offensive thing to say and can ruin people's lives. But they go, well, we're applying this bad explanation from this because we got to the right conclusion over here. And you go, we can have a conversation about both of those, but you don't get to propose a hypothesis, propose an explanation, and then apply it across the board to sexuality.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
a few more steps.
I think the eating disordered and disordered eating example is a really good one because, again, like looking at the natural law, right? You can't just look at the, good of like just one particular thing. You have to look at the holistic flourishing of the human person. And, for people for at least some people who struggle with eating disorders or disordered eating, one of the narratives that they really, really focus on is actually something that can sound a lot like natural law, which is an obsession about what's healthy and what's good for you. And so there's this hyper focus on doing things in a very particular way because in your mind, this is what's good for me based on these rules. And a lot of times these are rules from society of like certain types of food are good for you, certain types of food are bad for you. And so, they'll
diet with this number of calories.
Yeah.
Go over and it's like, well,
so they eat the good foods and they'll feel good about it. But then there's just something that isn't working. And so then they eat the bad foods, but they have to purge it. Or they feel they have to purge it. And for a lot of these people, actually the thing that will be helpful is focusing less on health, right? Moving out of these narratives where there's actually less of a focus on what's good for you. And in a lot of ways, that's actually runs really counter to the types of arguments that they're trying to make about sex and sexuality, which is that, when it comes to sex and sexuality, you need to focus more and more on what's good and these list of things and focus more on like a particular view of health that can be very intense and is extremely rules focused. And for a lot of people that struggle with eating disorders and disordered eating, it's an intense focus on rules that drives that. But I think there are a couple of things about like popular priests who, give those types of talks. One is it's a really good example of like bad use of natural law and a failure to really understand what natural law is. Two, it's a really bad understanding and representation of eating disorders and disordered eating that I think is really shaming to a lot of people. And like, I'm like really like frustrated about. And then over time, it demonstrates their deepening lack of knowledge. Deepening incompetence when it comes to addressing these things. And I do think that in these natural law circles, it's like the bad arguments, snowball into worse arguments over time.
Then with sexuality, the other reason why natural law in Catholic popular presentations, I think, is a very bad philosophy, not just bad morally, but sort of it's entirely unhelpful, is that you have this other distinction, which is uses other than or contrary to, which, to bring it back to my glass again, is like, why is it that like it's for drinking or sexuality is for babies and bonding? But if I use this glass just as a piece of art, if it were more ornate, it's used other than drinking, but somebody wouldn't say, oh, it's wrong for you to just have that glass in a cupboard. But putting it underneath the fridge, they would say, oh, that's an example of use contrary to. And so even with our lungs, to bring it back to the smoking example, smoking is a use other than breathing, and it's wrong. And Catholics might even say it's unhealthy, it's X, Y, and Z, it's not great. But smoking is still something you can do, and especially if you're Catholic, a lot of them will smoke cigars, where they wouldn't say it's healthy or that your lungs are meant for smoking, but to use them for smoking isn't always wrong. But to steal someone else's lungs while they're sleeping, we can't do that ever under any understanding. So with sexuality, you go, why is it that babies and bonding not only are two descriptively true terms, which is like, yes, sex is for babies and bonding in a conversational setting, but why is it that if one of those two are gone, specifically the baby said, why is that always wrong? And not just unwise, like smoking might be unwise, but why does the baby's element always have to be there in actuality or potentiality, which is like, I know there's going to be 4 asterisks and somebody going actually on the statement, but why is it that smoking, which leads to death, is not a natural law consideration? It's not contrary to your lungs, but getting married to another man or using birth control once ever is never acceptable. It's an intrinsic evil, can never be justified ever. Not just why would using birth control too much be unwise, but why is it that any birth control ever is always wrong? In smoking, it might be unwise, but you can still do it. Which isn't to say that every ethical system has to explain everything perfectly. I don't think anything does. But if you're saying natural law, when applied to sexuality, is immediately intuitive, why is using birth control once to save your wife's life or somebody being gay can never, ever be justified, ever. But smoking can.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think again, it comes back to, like, what is your view of natural law? Like, what's your vision for natural law? And I think that for a lot of people where, it is so rules focused and decontextualized, right? And I think that's partly why you get the, like, this is never okay ever. There's never a justification. People can die, but that doesn't matter because this is the rule, right? Which is a very different type of approach. Again, which comes back to like the question of human flourishing. And I understand why people don't want to take that latter approach, because the question of human flourishing, it feels like it's much more liable to error, right? And it is quite subjective, and our reasoning is often flawed. And we don't have the intellectual capacity of a god, and we have to deal with that. But, on the other hand, it's not like we don't see this other view also resulting in death and an inability to deal with exceptional cases, right? At least one can grapple with the reality, and then the other can't grapple with the reality. It just accepts death as just an unfortunate byproduct of a commitment to this position.
And that's where you have the ultimate Catholic bait and switch on the popular theology of the body talks, where they go, people that don't use birth control have lower divorce rates. People that don't sleep together before marriage have lower divorce rates. We actually know that families that practice this are happier. We know that studies show that pornography or masturbation have these negative health effects. That you actually, and a lot of speakers go, and my wife and I have incredible, amazing sex because we follow this rule. Where they'll sort of sell you on, or even, birth control is wrong, because I read this study where, hormonal birth control causes osteoporosis. And as Jason Everett points out, it makes the fish transgender. And all these different things where they'll sort of
Or transgender
sell, the transgendered fish persons. And they'll sort of sell you on the sexual prosperity gospel. And they'll talk to you about how certain studies actually back up their position. Yeah. But what I found is that this is a one-way valve, because the statement isn't, because of these things, then birth control is wrong. It's these things that we cite selectively that support ours are evidence of ours, but we're not tied to them. Because finding the studies that support them are a secondary matter to the position that they already arrived to. And so it is endlessly frustrating in debate contexts where they'll go X, Y, and Z about divorce, in marriage, in family, in happiness, in STDs, and whatever. Yeah. And then you bring up a counter study and you go, well, actually, the overwhelming consensus is that LGBT individuals having the option to marry members of the same sex reduces suicidality, increases happiness. Obviously, the marriage rate goes up when you actually allow them to get married, and they live better, fulfilling lives. They go,
and children have very similar outcomes, and
And so you bring that up, and they go, well, no, that's not the reason why we got to our position. And so they can ignore that data. And so it's this one-way valve where they get to cite every study that agrees with them, which are often, I've looked at the studies, and they're like 2 pages from decades ago. And if you look at the more modern studies, they're a little bit more nuanced. But Catholics will get to grab every study that they think agrees with them, every talking point that agrees with them, and then get to deny every other study out there. Which, to bring it back to Chris's point, where if natural law is building authentic human flourishing, you would look at the data. Not that you are tied to the data, but you would go, oh, we can update our understanding to be X, Y, and Z because we've looked at how the world works and we want people to flourish. The Catholic position is different because they go, well, these studies are evidence of our position, not that we got to this position from the evidence, because then you have counter evidence, which is all to say, oftentimes they'll sell you on things that they don't want you to be sold on a contrary idea to, because they got to the position first and then found the evidence.
Well, I think, there's something very similar here with, an inability of Catholics in all these spaces to do the, like, both and thing, which, as someone who grew up Catholic, I was always taught that, like, Catholicism is like a both and religion. But, when you're grappling with kind of these studies and you want to hold on to your position, right? And I think marriage is a great example. I think, like, adoption of kids by same-sex couples is a really good one. A lot of Catholics will want to say, well, okay, church teaching says that, and this is I would say that this is not necessarily a clear view, but a lot of Catholics would say that Catholic teaching says that same-sex couples should not adopt. And then, they'll pull up all these really old studies saying that, kids from same-sex couples don't have similar outcomes to opposite-sex couples. And then you read the study and you find out, oh, well, the study compared healthy, say, opposite-sex marriages to like the general same-sex
Well, the guy
couple.
from Austin who's in textbooks for being a complete fraud, and examples of like how to do bad statistics, or where a lot of Catholics pull their statistics from, is this guy who was a case study in statistics textbooks for being bad and lying. And then you look at the guy and then you go, wait, where do these Catholic studies on how gay couple adoption rates are bad?
Yeah.
It's from a literal fraud.
Yeah. Well, and then, so then you have that, and then you have like larger studies that actually do make the relevant distinctions when you're trying to understand like outcomes. And you'll find that, and they've consistently found that kids in same-sex versus opposite-sex households that are similarly situated have very similar outcomes. And there are a couple of moves that you could make here. One move is to immediately jump to, well, it all looks kosher, but we're just going to say that there must be something wrong with the study. That's one move you could make, because we want to hold on to this position. There's another move that you could make that's, oh, okay, that makes sense. I can understand all of this. That's very reasonable to me. And also, I still hold this view for these reasons, right? But I think that when you hold that very narrow rules-based approach to natural law, there's, again, this inability to deal with and to hold complexity, and which really, I think, comes off as weak, as intellectual weakness and a lack of integrity for people who don't already ascribe to those positions.
I've done a debate with Joe Heschmeyer on natural law and gay marriage, and in his follow-up video is the perfect example of this one-way valve, where he got to deny all of the meta-analyses that I threw out there, because, well, we're not tied to it per se, and we know X, Y, and Z, and when cornered on something like, well, we want stronger families as a society, yes, and we also know that gay couples adopting do just as good as straight couples when all relevant factors are accounted for. And they'll go, well, no, I mean, every child has a natural right to his or her mother and father. And you go, you just shifted from divorce rates being bad, which proves the Catholic position, to when I said, well, actually, this is good for kids. Now the good has shifted from being any sort of empirical or measurable thing to this esoteric out there thing, which is children have a natural right to their mother and father. And so you can make either of those arguments. You don't get to flip-flop between them, which is, in Joe Heschmeyer's follow-up video, he talks about the devastation that kids experience when a parent dies or when parents get divorced. And a lot of the study shows X, Y, and Z. And you go, yes, all those things are difficult on kids. And if we want to look at the data, destroying queer families is also going to be bad for the kids. Well, it's because we have this overriding thing, which is marriages for X, Y, and Z, and so it doesn't matter
anymore. Yeah,
it's like either the data matters or it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, a couple of things there. One is, you hear the argument, okay, well, kids have like a natural right to their biological parents. So, does that mean that biological parents should not be allowed to give up their kids for adoption in any circumstance, right? I think it's also important to just follow those lines of thought, because they will just say these things, and then no one will really question, what do you mean by that? What are the implications of that? And then when you tease it out, they find that actually they want to hold on to a lot of nuance and be able to tease things out, but you're not allowed to. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is, I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time studying like McIntyre, who's very interested in the rhetoric of rights, and also like very interested in like virtue ethics and natural law. And I think I derive a lot of my like ideas and dispositions from McIntyre, or from my study of McIntyre. And one of the things that he'll say is that, the way in which rights are talked about today are divorced from kind of an integrated understanding of human nature, and a disconnection between what is good for people, the human flourishing as observable in the world, from what we ought to do. And he says when you have this connection, arguments over rights become contradictory and oh my gosh, I forget the term you use, but basically like irresolvable.
Mm-hmm.
And all what it ends up coming down to is people shouting out the rights that they want to hold to at each other. And so you don't really have moral discourse. It's just an unsolvable competition between various views of rights. And so when people say something like that, part of what I hear them doing is this thing that McIntyre's saying. It's, you know, just picking out the right that matters to you in a way that actually is not integrated into the conversation or question that we're really addressing, but you just want to lob something over the fence. And, you know, I think it can be a form of emotivism. But I think that's another example of how, you know, like unintegrated that approach to natural law is. And I think it's a pretty significant departure from the broader natural law tradition.
So in the words of Matt Walsh, who is a traditional Latin Mass Catholic, when asked the question of, well, gay couples shouldn't adopt, and then is asked, well, and how do we know that? Is that through studies? And he goes, well, we just know that.
Yeah.
And we don't need studies to say that.
Okay.
But then these same people will cite studies, which is, perhaps hormonal birth control has side effects. And they'll cite it like that the disclosure, if you ever get prescribed hormonal birth controls, isn't like 72 pages long. And they'll go, well, actually, we know it leads to osteoporosis. And then you go, yeah, so like, you do want to balance things, and we want women to have more options than mandatory birth control at 13. But if we're measuring and looking at side effects and pros and cons, then it also means when someone walks into the clinic in which another pregnancy would threaten their life, the side effect of pregnancy is death. And the Catholics go, no, I was told that when I was at my doctor's appointment and I'm still alive. And you go, yeah, you're still alive because you're still alive. But there's people in this room that aren't, that took the same risk. That just because you made it through or you're an exception to the rule doesn't mean that a doctor should be able or shouldn't be able to individually weigh the side effects. Because if we say, as Jason Everett always talks about with osteoporosis, if osteoporosis is a real concern as a side effect, and we ought not prescribe birth control because it might lead to osteoporosis. And then if you're in another situation in which there's a more negative side effect of pregnancy than osteoporosis, if our operative thing is pros and cons, then we got to focus on that. And so Catholics, and especially the Chastity Project and all of these major Catholic groups, they will cite study after study after study, the stuff on preeclampsia and all of these things. And you go, yes, that is great to be medically informed about your options. But you can't cite that here and then in very difficult situations go, well, we can't do X, Y, and Z.
I mean, yeah, the Chastity Project, I just like have so many thoughts about like the studies that they cite. I mean, you know, sometime after I raised it, they took it down. But I mean, for a period on their section on homosexuality, I think 3/4 of the research they cited were by either conversion therapists or by an alleged child predator, right? Which, I mean, and it stayed up even after the allegation arose. And so, you know, and for me, I also think with a lot of these organizations, and this is probably a separate conversation, you know, just like the lack of accountability and intellectual integrity and failing to address that fact before they just quietly take it down after it's been publicly raised by someone. I think to me that raises a lot of questions around the intellectual integrity of a lot of these organizations, and is partly why like I just don't feel a need even necessarily to respond to them, and why I also feel quite entitled to continue to raise that was up there, right? Just the lack of accountability after the fact. But, you know, when I think about people like, you know, Matt Fradd and all those people, you know, the natural law tradition, part of it is also a tradition of engagement. And like, I mean, Matt Fradd's just a cardboard cutout, right? Like he just, you know, presents like the arguments that you always know he's going to present because of the canned things, and they don't really offer anything other than like outrage, right? And I think again, like this coming back to, oh well, you just know it because you know it, when in reality, no, you don't. Like the person just told you they don't know it. You saying that they do know it doesn't change that. And to me, that evidences an approach to the intellectual life that's more characterized by attempted coercion than by actual thoughtfulness, which is, I mean, you know, he can do that. That's fine. That's just not what I'm interested in.
Because they'll sell it as we can reason to our positions. And if you just say, well, I'm Catholic and I believe in X, Y, and Z because of this understanding, once again, awesome, cool. But if you say, and I can arrive and I can prove these conclusions to you outside of the church, because reality is this way. And now you got to actually back that up, and you can't hide as soon as you go, well, what about X, Y, and Z? And you go, well, that goes against the Catholic understanding. It's like, okay, so you can do the this is my religion, or you can do the and I can prove this without my religion.
Yeah.
They'll often switch between the two so rapidly that it's unhelpful.
I mean, I'm fine with people doing both, but I think you should acknowledge
Yeah.
it, right? And I think that, like, you know, if you feel entitled to make certain kinds of arguments, the other side should be entitled to make those certain kinds of arguments as well. What I often take issue with is when people feel quite entitled to make those sorts of arguments and then take issue with other people doing the same thing, but on the other side.
Because you run into interesting things, to bring it back to our glass analogy on um, so if we look at questions, or to bring up once again, talking about sexual bulimia as homosexuality sometimes gets called. Um, if we talk about diet soda for a second, which is sort of like a funny example, which is diet soda is built expressly so that your body does not get calories out of it,
Mm-hmm.
but you get the flavor of it all. Because if your stomach is designed for flavor and for nutrition, diet soda would seem to be a use contrary to
Yeah.
it. And I'm not committed to that position because I don't think that position is true. But you go, well, and then Catholics will debate that back and forth.
Yeah, well, so John Corvino actually, I mean, this is like from the 90s, has this really clever argument, and it's exactly that. And I think it's around, I think he uses Pepsi as an example, and he does the natural law thing where he says, oh, okay, well, like, you know, if the end of drinking is hydration, and so you should do this, blah, blah. And then, you know, he sees like a guy with like a Coke in the room, and he's like, what are you drinking? And he's basically like, oh, well, you know, like, what does that Coke do? Let's take a look at it. It has like this amount of sugar in it. Oh, and it has this caffeine in it. And so actually it doesn't support the end of hydration because caffeine's going to dehydrate you, you pervert, you know, and it's this really clever argument. And I do think, and maybe that might be worth unpacking a little bit. You know, in my early days when I was really committed to, I think a different approach to natural law, I think I would have just really readily dismissed John Corvino's argument and just say, well, that's like a clever little game, but it doesn't really, it just didn't make sense to me at the time. Now I actually do think it's a really clever and important argument, and one that I think I have to, you know, continually grapple with, and is partly why I take more seriously the counter argument of like smoking, right? And I don't have an easy answer. I think for me, as someone who, you know, doesn't necessarily want to wholesale throw out like Catholic teaching to sexuality, I don't have a good way to make that make sense, right? And I also think it's okay to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Well, because I think growing up, you start realizing that the world's slightly more complex than everything in the world and every moral decision. If you just scan it with your wand of right or wrong, it gets you the exact return like you're at the TSA. It's an example of diet soda Catholics will laugh at, which is proof that natural law as the only operative thing in a new Catholic understanding, natural law, theology of the body type of way, is absurd. Because you go, well, natural law doesn't have anything to say about a diet soda. And you go, yeah, then we're not tied to your understanding of natural law. Because if this thing is that everything has teloi, which is like the Greek word for ends in a certain sense, if everything has these very specific things that we can scan, then we'd be able to scan soda. And you scan soda and you could figure out, well, these you can use soda for this. You can never use soda for this, and if you want, you can use soda for this, which is sort of absurd. You would go, well, yeah, maybe having 1,000 Diet Cokes a day wouldn't be good for your health. And it's not because it works against the ends or the teloi of your bloodstream. It's because you're going to die, and not dying seems like a prior. Or maybe having only the highest calorie sodas isn't going to be great because it might lead to obesity, and that also has other side effects. So you might spend too much money, right? We're looking at other things in the soda example, which is proof that that's the same thing we should be doing with matters of human sexuality, which is what we do and don't allow in society, and what we shame or what we make illegal versus what we shame versus what we're neutral to versus what we encourage should also be a dynamic enterprise in which we are looking at these questions seriously around all of these decisions. And to just say, well, you know, gay sex works against the ends of or it works against the teloi and is contrary to, and it must always be wrong, is an absurd statement. We can look at these questions, and just because we disagree with theology of the body, understanding of the world, of being able to scan every single item and read the list, Just because we say that, I have had a number of Catholics who go, so what's the alternative?
Yeah.
And you go, the alternative is that like not every moral action is clearly I don't have to have a contrary moral system to support if I think that you are absurd. Because if I go, well, everything's right or wrong in proportion to how much I can gamble if I sell it. And every moral system is some convoluted,
Yeah.
weird world of because the flying spaghetti monster sent me. I don't have to, in order to reject that, which is a sort of atheist trope, like if I want to reject the flying, every moral act being right or wrong according to the flying spaghetti monster, I don't have to have the solution. I can go, that's absurd. And the same thing with this theology of the body idea of the world is that matters of sexuality and authentic human flourishing are difficult. And we don't want people gooning all day long. But the alternative is not Christopher West gets to control all of your sex lives.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that the alternative to that, like constantly scanning, what's the scanner called?
The scanning, the Teloi scanner.
The Teloi scanner. I think the alternative to like living your life by the Teloi scanner is like it's living your life, right? And I think that's part of what one of the ways in which like this like particular type of natural law can get wrong, and I think that there are ways in which a lot of these people relate to sex and sexuality where they relate to it as if the point of it is to be able to explain it well, right? As opposed to actually like come to an integrated, habitually virtuous relationship to it. Similarly, like, with your like cup of coffee, like you shouldn't, the point of the cup of coffee is to not have the intellectual explanation for it. The point of the cup of coffee is to like enjoy it and like get your little caffeine so you can have like a fun conversation or be very like alert at work, right? And I think that a lot of these people and part of this, I think a lot of these arguments occur with people that are chronically online. I think partly because for them the point of this is to be constantly talking about it. And when you learn to let go and make it less about getting everything about the theory right and making sure that you're living every point about the theory right, you can actually engage with the world as it is. My general view is that I tend to be skeptical of people who write about sex in a way where it feels like a theory and it doesn't feel like beautiful or appealing or compelling. For me, I'm like, if this is your presentation of like sex and sexuality, I don't think anyone should want it, right? And that's not to say that there's anything wrong with, theorizing and conceptualizing and writing in ways that are abstract. I personally have a lot of love for that kind of thing. But the point isn't the abstraction. And I think Aquinas is actually a really good example of this. When Aquinas like finishes this, or at least didn't finish Summa, but was writing the Summa and just said like, it's straw, right? I think a lot of Catholics just kind of write that off, and a lot of people who respect natural law just kind of write that off. And I think that's just such a silly move. That's such an outlandish statement for Aquinas to say about his own work and his seminal work. And it's so outlandish that I think you really need to spend time grappling with it. And to me, it suggests that if following Aquinas for you means you spend all of your life just reading and analyzing this thing, and that's all you do, what Aquinas had to say about the Summa suggests that you are not spending your time very well.
I think the issue with these conversations on sexuality in the church is that people have been taught for so long that it's an either or type of situation. It's either we see masturbation as an intrinsic evil that can never be justified ever, or I'm going to become a moral degenerate. It's going to take over my life. And I've heard stories of people that masturbate 72 billion times a day. And so we don't want that. So I'll take this. But if you talk to anybody who operates in the real world, or even sex therapists who this is all that they work with in terms of their clientele, you can still maintain the position that, if you're spending all of your money on pornography, like you should probably get some help. And also, a married couple looking at porn once doesn't mean that the world has ended and their marriage is vapid and it can never be allowed. That there's a lot more in between. And same thing with, it's not either we throw gay people in jail or we make everybody gay. There's a few steps in between that. But a lot of times it's this reflexive, like, matters of sexuality become so complex,
Yeah.
and people are scared to confront the reality that there might not be perfect solutions for your life that work for everybody else's life. And you can, but that's scary to have to like
Yeah.
wade into the complexity. So I'm going to reflexively grasp this because it explains the world and makes things make sense.
Yeah.
But the real world doesn't make sense. And if you are looking at exiting this natural law view of the world with your Teloi scanner, you can still say that things are right or wrong, right? Just sort of as Chris and I are talking about, things are complex doesn't mean that things that are illegal that harm people are complex, right? It's not either everything's complex or everything's black and white. That you can wade beyond this belief system, and there's a lot more out there in academia, as we're talking about, even natural law. The Catholic position is not all of natural law, and natural law is not all of philosophy or ethics.
Yeah.
There's a lot more positions between theology of the body and complete solipsism. Like there's so many steps in between, but they don't want to tell you that. And so I always feel like so much of this Catholic ink apologetics relies on people listening not actually reading a basic ethics textbook.
Yeah.
Because they only hear about.
I mean, like even reading the text that they cite and that they talk about, right? You know, I've certainly been guilty of this. You know, I think about, you know, like even Catholic teaching on sex and sexuality. You know, I was rereading the Catechism on chastity recently.
2358.
As one does. That's right. And one of the things that really struck me on this reading, that I'm kind of taking this more kind of like holistic view when it comes to these matters, is the Catechism says that, you know, chastity presupposes a respect for the rights of persons, especially the right to education and information regarding the spiritual and human dimensions of the person. And it had never struck me before that chastity presupposes a lot of things that are not about sex, right? And for me, when I think about, it presupposes respect for the rights of persons, I think, you know, like a respect for like the rights of workers. And when I think about churches that, you know, preach about chastity and have all of these really strict views about how people are supposed to live their sexual lives, but then don't pay their workers a living wage, to me, there's a deep incongruency there, and something that's actually in the environment and culture of the parish that is against a cultivation of chastity. But because we want chastity to just be this narrow thing, that incongruence there doesn't have space or acknowledgement. And it makes sense. And, you know, we have an essay that'll come out that talks about some of this. You know, also makes sense with, there's a study like decades ago by a guy who had studied celibacy among the clergy. And in general, he found that they were not doing a great job.
Like a really bad job.
Yeah, so bad. But for people who'd had a mature adjustment to celibacy, he said they had 4 things. They had commitment to service, well-adjusted prayer life, a strong sense of community, and productive work. And for me, that once again speaks to, you know, this virtue of chastity is a virtue that's concerned with general human flourishing. And if we want to be concerned about this as a virtue, a la the natural law tradition, we also need to be concerned about things like communities that are available to people, the rights of workers, you know, how is their prayer life? And, you know, maybe if Catholics want to take more of a like truly like natural law, but then also a more Catholic approach that's more consistent with the catechism, you know, the approach to chastity should be focused much more on general human flourishing. But that's not where we see most of the like public discourse these days.
We think about even premarital sex, where the idea is like, well, if we allow for premarital sex, it means that people can use each other and aren't committed to each other, and so we keep it in marriage. And then you go, the number of Catholic couples that I know my age from college who got married so they could finally start having sex, where putting this hard and fast rule, which is we want to protect people from being used, and so we're going to reserve for marriage. And then you realize that marriage becomes even more of a trap because you can't even get divorced under a Catholic system. It's like this general idea, this good idea, which is we don't want to be using people. Actually, you end up using people by having it focused just on the rules. And not that we can't have moral statements in society, But if the position is chastity is freedom to love, that we want to not use people, that we want to see all of the human person, to hold those at the top of our moral decision-making flowcharts, and then revise our flowcharts according to those
Mm.
is a much better approach than just going, well, the flowchart's here. And then when we have cases of Catholics stuck in marriages that they can never get divorced from,
Yeah.
even after domestic violence, it might be able to separate.
Yeah.
Are you free to love if your spouse has beaten you almost to the point of death and you are not permitted to love somebody again the rest of your life?
Yeah.
Like, this rule that you have made has now destroyed you in the process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think about, if the reason you're getting married is that you can finally have sex with someone,
Mhm.
to me, that actually feels like a deeply objectifying approach to marriage.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing. I think the other thing that I would say is that, again, this approach to natural law that like begins with the rules,
Mhm.
to me just again feels very inconsistent with like the foundations of natural law. For me, if you want to take a natural law approach, I would recommend like starting with where Aristotle started,
Yeah.
which is just like observe the world,
Mhm.
right? Like, and actually see where things are. I think this commitment to like logical structures can be a way of bypassing seeing what the world is actually like. Right. And I think this is very similar to like what a lot of like good like pastoral counselors and like good therapists recommend is like always starting with like accompaniment, like seeing where people actually are as opposed to where you want them to be. And that doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion about where you want them to be. That doesn't mean that these logical structures don't have a role to play as you're unpacking how do I respond to these situations in the world. But if you're starting there, it's a deeply objectifying way to approach other people. And I also just think that it's starting with a different foundation from where Aristotle
Mhm.
started.
And that's my last and final point, is that the Catholic approach, or the Catholic approach that I often get told in debates and that a lot of Catholic Inc. uses, is unprincipled, even if it's internally consistent.
Hmm.
Because you have all of these very nuanced takes on, um, if a couple can't have kids, what are the things and the reasons why that might happen that still allow for marriage? At what points is this allowed? What couples can never get married? Or when it comes to sexuality, where you have this idea of like in actuality and in principle, and you have very, very complex rules on Catholic sexuality. Nobody in academia respects the Catholic position as a lot of people present it, because you don't go from, well, sex is for babies and bonding, and get to this sort of, well, if you have a war veteran who was exploded by an IED, he can't actually get married for the rest of his life.
Hmm.
But if a couple is experiencing some form of infertility, they still can. But if they can, and then they're married, and then some tragic accident happens, they can stay married. There's this convoluted flow chart that we don't have time to get into, but even when it comes to what sexual practices are allowed, even between straight couples, or hormonal birth control in certain circumstances for other things, that all of the rules in these flowcharts are infinitely complex. And no academic goes, well, yeah, we can get from babies and bonding to if somebody needs hormonal birth control because of a particular hormonal issue, she can take it for this medical issue, and as a byproduct, might be able to then she won't conceive. But if somebody just took the birth control without this other condition, then it wouldn't be allowed. And all of these complex rules that I think most Catholics don't even know about. Um, you don't get there from a universal idea of just like, let's observe what sex is used for.
Hmm.
Which isn't to say that Chris and I have the perfect ethical system. But if you propose that as immediately and intuitively obvious to all people as they participate in searching for human freedom, they will end up at the Catholic position. You have now worked yourself into a position that no serious academic respects, because it's internally consistent, but doesn't follow the universal or these imperatives at the beginning. It's not a serious it's not a serious academic endeavor. If you say the natural law is man's participation in the moral law or the eternal law, or the natural law is whatever God has dictated, that's one conversation, but be honest about it. Don't try to sell people on this. Well, I'm just observing reality. If reality doesn't match up to your rules, you override reality. Just be honest with it at the end of the day and allow people the ideas to seriously interrogate these ideas, in not selling them short of what philosophy or medical science has to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would also add, I think it's important to exercise a great deal of humility when you're talking about the reality of the world. I think that our understanding of the reality of the world is always developing as we continue to learn more, both about the world and about ourselves. And I think that there's a great tendency to fail to take into account the ways in which our personal limitations also limit our ability to really understand the world as it is. And I mean, I tend to think that intellectual understanding, like really deep and philosophical understanding, requires not just a great deal of intellectual virtue, but also a great deal of moral virtue. And so I think it's really important to be humble in these spaces. And I often, will not always, I mean, maybe I would tend to assume that people who fail to exercise humility tend to lack the moral virtues involved in true understanding.
For all the talk about moral degeneracy of society, if you're both yelling at people for being sodomites in comment sections and also saying we have to ban gay marriage because of moral degeneracy, like maybe that one's on you. Especially if you're one of the clowns that are throwing racial slurs around and then talking about moral degeneracy. Like, maybe we had a few things to look at in your own case before we talk about the state of gender-affirming care. Maybe stop being such a moral degenerate before you start throwing stones, which is not relevant to most Catholics. But if you're in my comment sections, you know who I am talking to. About this obsession on moral degeneracy. It is like, maybe stop defending slavery. And then we can talk about how we want to have medical review boards go after we both agree that slavery is wrong and not the other way around. That's my moral. I know who we're talking to. Yeah, so that's Chris and I's infinitely long discussion on natural law.
Yeah.
And yeah, we could keep going. If you're confused what natural law is at the end of this still,
That's fine.
That's fine, because most people who talk about it online and reference it don't know. You talk to Catholic priests or apologists, and they couldn't give you a better definition than what Chris and I have rambled about for an hour and a half. If you don't know what we're talking about and have never encountered Catholic arguments, I thank you for listening, but I don't know
how you made it to the end.
Because none of this makes sense. If you're just like, oh, I was raised Catholic. This isn't,
This is like some insider
this is insider baseball. So that concludes the discussion.
Yeah.
Chris and I don't have the answers to the entire world. And just because someone says that they don't have the answers like us, and then you hear someone that says we have the answers, maybe they don't. Maybe they don't. Maybe it feels nice to have answers. Are they the right ones? Maybe not. Follow Chris. See Damian Writes on all major platforms. Also on Spotify these days. And also Substack if we're on his channel. And then with me, just look up Intrinsically Ordered for my podcast. Or if this is on my podcast, you'll already be listening to it. And you can follow me everywhere else. Of course, hit up my Patreon. And also matching donations to Chris's. If this is his. I don't know. We'll end up there.
All right. Sounds good.